The Whitlock estate was a place of contradictions. By day, it paraded as a beacon of charity. By night, it swallowed children whole. To the outside world, the Whitlocks were saints. To the children trapped within, they were shadows that erased names, faces, and futures. Enter Titan, a German shepherd trained to protect. He couldn't know the depth of the horrors inside. All he knew was that something was wrong. His instincts led him to a door no one wanted opened, to a cellar where Hannah waited with eyes too old for her age. When she wrapped her arms around Titan's neck, the cameras captured more than an embrace. They captured defiance. A girl who had been discarded was alive, and a dog had carried her story into the light. What followed would shake the nation. Laws would change. Families would march. And Titan, the loyal German shepherd, would become a symbol that no matter how deep the silence, loyalty and love can still be louder. The Whitlock estate loomed above the town like something out of a fairy tale. White columns rising against a pale Oregon sky, ivy curling along iron balconies, manicured hedges cut into sharp geometry. On that summer evening, lanterns glowed across the sprawling lawn, where tables draped in silk held champagne flutes and delicate pastries that no child in foster care had ever tasted. Cars glided up the long gravel drive, headlights scattering across the marble fountain where an angel poured water into an endless pool. Politicians in tailored suits stepped out beside clergymen in robes. Journalists balanced cameras, whispering about the wealth of their hosts. And always, always, the same word passed between lips with reverence. Compassion. The Whitlocks, Henry and Margaret, greeted each guest at the entrance as though they were royalty. Henry's handshake was firm, his smile practiced to look warm yet dignified. Margaret wore a gown of emerald green, pearls at her throat, her lipstick painted in the same shade as ripe cherries. She leaned close to kiss cheeks, her perfume drifting like a veil, promising grace and benevolence. "You've done so much good," the mayor told her, squeezing her hands. "And so much more to do," Margaret replied, eyes shining. "Children are our nation's future. We simply give them what they deserve. A chance." The crowd murmured their admiration. But the true show had yet to begin. At Margaret's signal, the heavy oak doors opened, and a line of children stepped out into the evening light. They were dressed in immaculate uniforms, navy blazers, polished shoes, bows tied with precision. Their faces were scrubbed clean, hair parted neatly, each one carrying a slim book clutched to their chest. They lined up in 2 rows, perfectly symmetrical, like soldiers ready for inspection. A hush fell across the lawn. One by one, the children recited. A girl with trembling hands read a sonnet. A boy no older than 12 recited the multiplication tables with robotic perfection. Another delivered a speech about gratitude, her voice cracking but steady. The audience applauded after each, some wiping tears, marveling at the discipline, the promise, the miracle of the Whitlocks household. Henry clapped his hands together. "You see, friends, every child has brilliance within them. It only takes a little guidance." The crowd erupted with cheers, cameras flashing. To outsiders, it was a portrait of charity at its finest, broken children transformed into stars. But if one looked closely, closer than anyone cared to, the cracks were visible. A boy at the end of the line coughed nervously, his body jerking with the effort. The sound echoed far too loudly in the silence. Margaret's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. Then, with a flick of her hand, a stern caretaker stepped forward, gripping the boy by the shoulder. He was ushered away so quickly that the guests barely noticed. The other children straightened at once, eyes forward, mouths tight. None of them flinched. None dared to break formation. The applause drowned out the unease. Later, as the orchestra played beneath strings of golden lights, guests toasted to the Whitlocks' generosity. Margaret glided between tables, her hand resting on shoulders, her laughter soft as velvet. The word saintly was whispered again and again. But the children sat at a long table of their own, separate, their plates filled but untouched. They smiled when spoken to, but their eyes, those eyes betrayed something else. A silence behind the rehearsed answers, a shadow behind the shine. Detective Elena Ruiz, attending only because she had been invited in her official capacity, noticed. She stood at the edges of the lawn, sipping sparkling water, scanning the children. Something in their posture unsettled her, the way they all seemed to breathe in rhythm, as if they'd been trained. She jotted a note in her small leather pad. Nothing actionable, nothing more than instinct. But her gaze lingered when she saw the empty seat at the children's table. No name card, no explanation. As the evening waned, Margaret called the children to stand once more. Together, they sang a hymn in perfect harmony. Their voices were angelic, but to some, if they dared to listen closely, there was a trembling in those high notes, a plea hidden in the beauty. The final chord faded into the night air. The guests leapt to their feet, clapping thunderously. Henry raised his glass. "To family," he proclaimed. "Not the one we are born into, but the one we choose." Glasses clinked, laughter rose, and the celebration continued into the warm hours of the night. And yet, above it all, the Whitlock mansion stood silent and brooding. Its shuttered windows reflected the light of torches and lanterns, but inside, deep within its walls, another light flickered. A weak bulb, somewhere below, barely illuminating damp stone and claw marks carved by hands too small to escape. The guests would never see it. Not yet. But for the children inside, and for Hannah, who had not yet crossed the threshold of this glittering prison, the night whispered of what was to come. The following morning, when the last champagne glass had been cleared and the great white tent on the lawn stood empty, a black sedan rolled slowly through the iron gates. Its windows were tinted, but if one looked closely enough, a small face could be seen pressed to the glass. Wide brown eyes, filled with wonder and uncertainty, followed the winding gravel drive until the car came to a stop before the mansion's grand steps. Hannah, 9 years old, a girl who still clung to a stuffed rabbit, missing one ear, held tightly against her chest. The driver opened her door. Hannah hesitated before stepping out, her sneakers crunching softly on the gravel. The sheer size of the Whitlock estate loomed over her, columns rising like giants, stained glass windows catching the morning sun. She had been told she was lucky, that she had been chosen by one of the most generous families in the state. Other children in the foster home whispered about it as if it were winning a golden ticket. Yet as Hannah stood before the doors, the air smelled less like luck and more like something she couldn't name. The doors opened with a heavy groan. Margaret Whitlock emerged, her emerald dress replaced now by a silk blouse and pearls that gleamed like frost. She smiled, arms outstretched, the very picture of maternal warmth. "Darling Hannah," she cooed, bending slightly so her eyes met the child's. "Welcome home." Her hands, pale and cool, cupped Hannah's cheeks, as she kissed her forehead. Cameras weren't there this morning. No crowd of admirers, yet Margaret played the role as if the world were still watching. For a moment, Hannah felt the warmth of those words. Welcome home. Words every foster child longs to hear. She wanted to believe them. She wanted to step into this house and finally lay down the weight of moving from place to place. But when Margaret pulled back, her gaze flickered, just a heartbeat of cold calculation behind the smile. Eyes sharp, measuring, as though she were appraising a piece of furniture rather than greeting a daughter. "Come, dear," Margaret said, looping an arm through Hannah's. "Let me show you where you'll be living." The marble foyer swallowed Hannah whole. Chandeliers glittered above, their crystals catching the sunlight like captured stars. The air smelled faintly of lemon polish and roses, the scent carefully chosen to mask something deeper. Children's voices echoed faintly from the east wing, though none appeared. Their laughter had the flat, brittle sound of rehearsed joy. Hannah tilted her head, listening, but Margaret's grip guided her down a corridor lined with portraits of solemn-looking Whitlock ancestors. "Here we are," Margaret announced, opening a door to a freshly made room. A four-poster bed with crisp white sheets, a desk stacked with sharpened pencils, shelves waiting to be filled with books. It was more than Hannah had ever had. She stepped inside slowly, running her fingers along the quilt, as though afraid it might vanish if she touched it too quickly. "Do you like it?" Margaret asked. Hannah nodded shyly. It's beautiful." "Good girl." The smile returned, though Margaret's eyes never softened. "Now rest. Tonight you'll meet your brothers and sisters properly. They'll be so excited to have you." Margaret excused herself, her footsteps fading down the hall. For the first time, Hannah was alone in her new room. She placed her rabbit carefully on the pillow, then wandered to the window. The gardens stretched endlessly, fountains spraying arcs of silver water. Beyond the hedges, the town was hidden by trees. The estate was its own world, self-contained, untouchable. But something tugged at her curiosity. The hallway beyond her door was unusually quiet. Hannah peeked out, tiptoeing a few steps until she reached another bedroom door left ajar. The bed inside was perfectly made, but there was dust on the desk, as though no one had lived there for months. On the dresser, a child's shoe lay forgotten, scuffed and small. She backed away, unease tightening her chest. A few steps farther, another room, also immaculate, untouched, but with a doll sitting upright on the bed, staring at the ceiling with cracked glass eyes, room after room. Some empty, some staged but hollow, all carrying the weight of absence. Hannah clutched the banister of the staircase, her breath shallow. Where had the children gone? Why were there so many rooms without occupants, when Margaret boasted of a household filled with sons and daughters? A floorboard creaked behind her. Hannah spun, heart racing. A caretaker in a dark suit stood watching her from the shadows of the corridor. His expression was unreadable, but his presence carried a warning. "You should stay in your room until dinner," he said softly. Hannah nodded quickly, scurrying back inside and shutting the door. She leaned against it, trembling. The room that had moments ago felt like a gift, now felt like a gilded cage. She crawled onto the bed, hugging her rabbit tight, whispering to herself that it was fine, that maybe she was just imagining things. But as the afternoon light shifted across the walls, Hannah couldn't shake the vision of those empty bedrooms. Beds turned down for children who never returned, dolls and shoes and notebooks left behind, like echoes of lives erased. And somewhere deep inside her chest, though she couldn't yet name it, Hannah felt the first fragile crack in the dream of being chosen. The Whitlocks had given her a home, but something told her this was not the kind of home anyone should long for. Night descended over the Whitlock estate like a heavy curtain. From her window, Hannah watched the last traces of pink fade from the Oregon sky, replaced by a dull gray that melted into darkness. The gardens below lay silent, fountains turned off, hedges standing like motionless sentries in the moonlight. She had been told to sleep early. "Big day tomorrow," Margaret had said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. But Hannah couldn't sleep. The sheets were too crisp, the room too perfect, and the silence too deep. At the foster home, there was always some noise. The hum of traffic, a baby crying, the shuffle of footsteps in the hall. Here, the quiet pressed against her ears like water, and her heart beat too loudly in her chest. She lay on her back, clutching her one-eared rabbit to her chin. Shadows stretched across the ceiling, twisting into shapes her mind turned into monsters. She turned over, burying her face in the pillow, trying to will herself into dreams. That was when she heard it. At first it was faint, so faint she thought it was the wind, a muffled sound rising through the floorboards beneath her bed. Hannah sat up, her breath caught in her throat, ears straining. It came again. A sob, not the soft whimper of someone having a bad dream. No, this was raw, broken, the sound of someone crying from a place of deep pain. She froze, the rabbit clutched tight. The sound was swallowed quickly by silence. But then another came, longer, trembling, echoing up from below her. Hannah slid off the bed, feet bare against the polished wood. She crouched low, pressing her ear to the floor. The boards were cold, the varnish smooth against her skin. This time, she heard more clearly. A child's voice, muffled, pleading. Then a second noise, the harsh scraping of something metal against stone. Chains. Her blood ran cold. She pulled back, sitting hard on the floor, her tiny chest rising and falling in sharp bursts. She wanted to scream, to call for someone, but instinct told her not to. Not here, not in this house. The sobbing returned, softer now, like someone trying not to be heard. Hannah crawled back onto her bed, hugging her rabbit, eyes darting around the room, as if the walls themselves might reveal the truth. "Hello?" she whispered into the darkness, her voice shaking. Is someone there?" For a moment, nothing. Just her own breathing and the faint tick of the clock on her desk. Then silence. Complete, suffocating silence. She waited, heart pounding, whispering again, a little louder. "I hear you. Don't be scared." But the crying had stopped. The scraping had stopped. The house seemed to hold its breath. And in that silence, Hannah felt a terrible loneliness, as though the walls were swallowing her words before they could reach anyone. She curled beneath the blanket, squeezing her eyes shut, trying to pretend she had imagined it. But the sound lingered in her mind. The chains, the sobs, the hollow despair in that hidden voice. Minutes passed, maybe hours. She didn't know. But somewhere deep inside, a seed of dread took root. It wasn't just the empty rooms she had seen earlier. It wasn't just the cold eyes of Margaret Whitlock when no one else was watching. It was this, the sound of another child suffering, just below her feet, erased from the world yet still here, hidden in the bowels of this house. Hannah lay still, eyes wide in the dark, unable to sleep. She clutched her rabbit so tightly its seams strained, whispering a promise only she could hear. I won't forget you." But as the night wore on and the silence thickened, Hannah felt the terrible truth sink in. In the Whitlock mansion, children who weren't perfect didn't just leave, they vanished. And now she was one of them. Morning broke with sunlight slanting through the Whitlock estate's tall windows, gilding the marble floors in gold. The house looked serene in daylight, almost holy, as if the horrors whispered in the night were only a dream. But Hannah knew what she had heard. The echo of sobs beneath her room clung to her like cobwebs. At breakfast, the children sat in rigid silence, utensils aligned perfectly beside their plates. They waited, motionless, until Margaret Whitlock gave a small nod, granting permission to eat. Even then, their movements were precise, rehearsed. Every bite cut at the same angle, every napkin folded neatly after use. Hannah copied clumsily, afraid to make a sound. When Henry tapped his glass with a fork, the children immediately set down their utensils, backs straightening in unison. "Today," he announced, "we remind ourselves that discipline is the mother of excellence." His baritone carried across the table like a sermon. Margaret's smile gleamed. "Children, to study." The study was a cavernous room lined with mahogany shelves, filled with dictionaries, hymnals, and volumes of philosophy far beyond a child's comprehension. At the front stood a long table, polished to a mirror shine. The children filed in, taking their seats without a word. Margaret and Henry paced behind them, like commanders inspecting recruits. Caretakers distributed books and sheet music. A small bell rang. The drills began. "Manners first," Margaret declared. Posture, diction, gratitude. One by one, the children rose to recite lines. "Thank you for this meal. I am grateful for the opportunity." Their voices were steady, mechanical, as though they had been drilled hundreds of times. When Hannah's turn came, she stumbled over the words, her voice too soft. "Louder," Margaret instructed, her tone sharp beneath the velvet. Hannah repeated it, louder this time, her cheeks burning as all eyes turned on her. "Better," Margaret said. But she wrote something in a small black leather book she kept tucked under her arm. The scratching of her pen was louder in Hannah's ears than her own heartbeat. Next came music. A piano sat gleaming at the end of the room. Each child was expected to play a piece flawlessly. Fingers danced over the keys, notes spilling out with robotic precision. When Hannah sat at the bench, her palms damp with sweat, she faltered on the second line. A wrong note rang sharp and jarring. The room froze. Margaret's smile never wavered, but her hand moved again to the black book. Another line of ink. "Continue," she said softly. Hannah pushed through the rest, each note trembling, her vision blurring with unshed tears. When she finished, no applause came, only silence, heavy and suffocating. Finally came academics. Books slammed open, pages filled with equations and vocabulary lists. The children bent over them, pencils scratching furiously. Mistakes were not corrected with gentle guidance, but with stern lectures, sometimes lasting 10 minutes over a single misplaced digit. Hannah's stomach knotted when she reached the arithmetic section. Numbers swam before her eyes. She had never been good at math, not in the foster homes, not in school. She bit her lip, trying to steady her hand, but the answer wouldn't come. Her pencil hovered. Sweat dampened her temple. She glanced up and found Margaret's gaze fixed on her. Not unkind, not cruel, but measuring. The tip of her pen touched the black leather book once again. The room seemed to tilt. Hannah forced herself to scribble an answer, though she knew it was wrong. The silence pressed heavier. She could feel it, the judgment of every child beside her, of Margaret behind her, of the house itself watching. When the bell finally rang to end lessons, the children rose in perfect formation, chairs sliding back in unison. Hannah scrambled to her feet, nearly tripping in her haste. Margaret closed the black book with a soft snap. She set it on the desk, one manicured hand resting on the cover. "Excellence," she said, her voice smooth as silk, "is not a gift. It is earned. Every day, every moment. You will remember that." The children nodded in perfect synchrony. Hannah nodded too, but her throat was dry, her chest aching. She could still hear the faint scratching of Margaret's pen, branding her mistakes into permanence. That evening, Hannah sat alone in her room, staring at her rabbit. She whispered to it, as if the toy could listen. "They're always watching. Even when you breathe, they watch." Her words hung in the silence. She thought of the empty bedrooms, the muffled sobs beneath the floor, the children's stiff postures. And now this, the endless drills, the black leather book recording every failure. She felt as though she was standing on a thin sheet of ice, every misstep cracking it further. And beneath the ice, something waited. Something she could not yet see, but could feel pressing up from the darkness below. Hannah first noticed him during supper, sitting 2 seats down at the children's long dining table. A boy with sandy hair that fell into his eyes, shoulders slightly hunched as though he were trying to make himself smaller. While the other children moved with robotic precision, forks lifted at the same time, bites taken in unison, this boy hesitated. His spoon trembled when he lifted it. His nameplate, etched neatly in gold, read, "Caleb." He didn't speak that evening, not until later, when the house fell into its hushed rhythms. Hannah had slipped out of her room with her rabbit tucked under her arm, wandering the corridor in search of air that didn't feel so heavy. That's when she saw him, crouched in a shadowed corner near the library doors. He was startled when he noticed her. His eyes darted left and right, as if expecting to be caught. Then, in a whisper rough as dry leaves, he said, "You shouldn't be here." Hannah hugged the rabbit tighter. "Neither should you." That earned her the faintest twitch of a smile, a fragile bridge between strangers. Over the next few days, their paths crossed again and again. In the study, Caleb slipped her an extra pencil when hers broke. During drills, when her voice wavered, he mouthed the words to help her remember. Small kindnesses in a place where kindness was rationed. Finally, one afternoon, as the other children marched in line toward the music room, Caleb leaned close enough for her to hear. His voice was almost inaudible, carried on the faintest breath. "Don't make mistakes," he said. Hannah frowned. "Why?" "Because—" His eyes flicked to the black leather book in Margaret's hands. "Children, who aren't perfect, disappear." The words sent a chill crawling across Hannah's skin. She wanted to ask more, but a caretaker's shadow loomed across the hall, and Caleb snapped back into line, face blank, eyes forward, as if he hadn't spoken at all. That night, Hannah couldn't sleep. His whisper echoed in her head. Disappear. She thought of the abandoned rooms, the half-forgotten toys, the doll with the cracked glass eyes, the muffled sobs under the floorboards, and she knew, deep in her bones, that Caleb wasn't lying. The next morning at breakfast, Caleb wasn't at the table. His nameplate was still there, polished and gleaming, but his chair sat empty. "Where's Caleb?" Hannah asked, her voice timid. Margaret, seated at the head of the table, dabbed her lips delicately with a napkin. "Caleb has gone to another home," she said smoothly. "One better suited for his temperament." Her tone was light, but her eyes lingered on Hannah, heavy with warning. The children around the table kept eating, their faces expressionless. Not a single glance at the empty chair. Not a single word was spoken. But Hannah noticed their hands, trembling slightly as they cut their food. She noticed their eyes, flicking once, quickly, to where Caleb should have been, before snapping back down. It was fear. Pure, quiet fear. By evening, the nameplate was gone, the chair pushed in, as if no boy named Caleb had ever sat there. His notebooks vanished from the study shelves. His shoes, once lined neatly by the door, had disappeared. Hannah searched for him anyway. She peeked into the abandoned bedrooms, her breath catching when she thought she saw a shadow move. She lingered near the cellar door, pressing her ear against the wood, listening for chains, for sobs, for whispers that might belong to him. But there was nothing. Only silence. At supper the following night, Hannah sat stiffly at her place, her eyes locked on the space where Caleb had been. No one mentioned his name. No one dared. When Margaret's gaze swept down the table, Hannah lowered her eyes, but inside, her small hands curled into fists. She knew what had happened. Caleb hadn't gone to another home. Caleb had vanished, just like the others. And Hannah understood something she hadn't before. The Whitlock mansion was not a sanctuary. It was a trap, and she was already inside it. The first thunder rolled over the valley like a drumbeat of war. Rain lashed against the tall windows of the Whitlock estate, streaking the glass in trembling rivers. Lightning illuminated the gardens in sharp flashes, making the hedges look like dark creatures crouched in the storm. Hannah lay awake in her bed, knees drawn to her chest, her rabbit pressed tightly under her chin. She had not spoken Caleb's name aloud since he disappeared. No one had. But his whisper, "Children who aren't perfect disappear," haunted her more than the storm outside. The wind howled, rattling the shutters. Somewhere in the east wing, a window banged open and shut, until a caretaker hurried to silence it. The house itself seemed restless, its bones creaking as if trying to speak. Then Hannah heard it. At first, she thought it was the storm, a faint cry drowned beneath the roar of thunder. But when the thunder passed, the sound remained. A child's sobs, muffled and low, rising from somewhere beneath the floorboards. Her breath caught. She pressed her ear to the wooden planks, the varnish cold against her cheek. The sobbing grew clearer, broken whimpers, punctuated by the scrape of something metallic dragging across stone. Chains. Her heart pounded so hard, she thought it might give her away. She sat frozen, trembling, staring into the darkness of her room. Another sob, louder this time, closer. Hannah's throat tightened. Her hands shook as she crawled off the bed and onto the floor. She pressed her palms flat against the boards, feeling the vibration of the voice. Slowly, carefully, she knocked. Just once. A soft tap, as if to say, "I hear you." The crying faltered. Hannah leaned close, her lips almost brushing the floor. Her whisper cracked with fear and hope all at once. "I'm here." Silence. For a moment, she thought she had imagined it, that her mind had conjured ghosts from the shadows of Caleb's absence. But then came the faintest sound. A breath, long and shaky, just beneath her. A presence that wasn't the storm, wasn't the wind. Then it stopped. Everything stopped. The sobs, the scraping, even the storm seemed to fade for a heartbeat. Hannah pulled back, a chill crawling up her spine. The silence wasn't empty. It was full, heavy, watching. She didn't know how she knew, but she felt it. Something down there had turned its attention to her. Not just a child, not just another captive voice, but something colder, sharper, inhumanely cruel. The kind of presence that feeds on silence, that waits for weakness. Her rabbit slipped from her grip, landing on the floor with a soft thud. She snatched it back instantly, clutching it to her chest. Her eyes darted to the door, half expecting it to burst open, but the hallway remained still. She climbed back into bed, pulling the blanket over her head. She wanted to believe the covers could protect her, could hide her from whatever had just shifted beneath the mansion. But even under the blanket, she could feel it. That gaze. That terrible weight pressing upward through the floorboards, as though the house itself had opened its eyes and fixed them on her. The storm raged on outside, thunder splitting the sky. Yet it was not the storm that kept Hannah awake. It was the silence beneath her. The silence that knew her name. Sunday mornings at the Whitlock estate were unlike any other day. The children dressed in immaculate uniforms, collars stiff, shoes polished until they gleamed. They assembled in the great hall, where the chandeliers threw fractured light across the room, turning their faces into pale, expectant masks. It was examination day. The children stood in a line, hands clasped in front of them. Margaret Whitlock sat at the head of a long oak table, her black leather book resting open, pen poised. Henry stood behind her with folded arms, his gaze cold and unblinking. Around the edges of the room, caretakers stood like sentinels, silent, watchful. One by one, each child was called forward. They recited multiplication tables, quoted poems and translated Latin phrases. The air was taut with fear, every answer delivered in voices that wavered between pride and desperation. When Hannah's name was called, her stomach turned to stone. She stepped forward, clutching her rabbit so tightly in her pocket that the fabric strained. She felt the other children's eyes on her, their faces frozen into masks of indifference. But beneath them, she sensed something else. Pity. 7 times 9, Henry asked, his voice sharp. Hannah froze. Her mind went blank. The numbers swirled and slipped like minnows in dark water. She tried to reach for the answer, but nothing came. Her lips parted, but no sound emerged. Margaret's pen scratched once against the page of her book. Hannah panicked. 75? She whispered. A murmur rippled down the line of children. Hannah's cheeks burned hot. She knew it was wrong, but the number had leapt out before she could stop it. Margaret's smile thinned. Her lips pressed together, the corners tightening just enough to drain all warmth from her face. That, she said softly, is incorrect. The silence that followed was worse than shouting, worse than any punishment Hannah had ever known. It was a silence that carved itself into her bones, a verdict disguised as restraint. Margaret wrote again in the book. Another mark. Hannah stared at the black ink, her knees weak, her heart beating so hard she thought she might faint. You may return to your place, Henry said. Hannah shuffled back into line, her legs trembling. The rest of the examinations continued, but she heard nothing. Only the sound of Margaret's pen, scratching judgment into permanence. That night, Hannah lay awake, her heart still racing. Every creak of the house made her flinch. She replayed the moment again and again, her hesitation, her failure, the tightening of Margaret's lips. When the door to her room opened without warning, she sat up in bed, clutching the blanket. 2 caretakers entered, their faces expressionless. "Come with us," one said. "No," Hannah whispered, shaking her head. "Please." They didn't answer. Cold hands gripped her arms, pulling her from the bed. Her rabbit fell to the floor, forgotten in the struggle. "Let me go," she screamed, kicking wildly. Her foot struck one of them, but he only grunted, tightening his hold. "Please, somebody help." Her voice echoed down the corridor, but no door opened. No child stirred. The silence of the house smothered her cries. She was dragged down the long hallway, her heels scraping the polished wood. Her nails clawed against the walls, leaving faint streaks on the perfect white paint. At the front of the house, she heard the roar of an engine. The sedan idled in the driveway, headlights glowing like watchful eyes. "No," Hannah sobbed, thrashing harder. "Don't take me away." But instead of dragging her outside, the men turned down a narrow hallway she had never noticed before. The air grew colder, damper. The scent of lemon polish gave way to mildew. They stopped before a door made of iron, half hidden in shadow. It was locked with a heavy bolt. One of the men reached into his coat, producing a key that looked ancient, its teeth jagged like a predator's grin. The lock turned with a screech that cut through Hannah's pleas. The door swung inward, and a wave of damp, sour air poured out. "No," Hannah whispered, her voice small now, broken. "Please, I'll do better. I'll learn. I promise." The caretakers didn't answer. They dragged her across the threshold. The iron door groaned shut behind them, sealing away the last trace of light from the upstairs world. Ahead of her stretched darkness. The air carried the scent of rust and stone. Somewhere in the distance, a chain scraped faintly, followed by a sound that froze Hannah's blood. Soft, hopeless sobbing. She was not alone down here. The iron door clanged shut behind her, and the sound echoed down the stone corridor like the toll of a funeral bell. The caretakers dragged Hannah by the arms, her small feet stumbling over the uneven floor. The air was damp and cold, thick with the smell of mildew and rust. Somewhere, water dripped steadily, each drop like a ticking clock marking the end of something she could not name. They stopped at a wooden door braced with metal. One of the men yanked it open, revealing a narrow chamber. A single bulb hung from a frayed cord in the ceiling, its weak yellow light flickering as though it didn't even want to stay in this place. Without a word, they shoved her inside. Hannah fell to the floor, the stone biting cold against her knees. Her palms scraped against the rough surface, and when she lifted them, she saw flecks of dried brown. Blood, old and dark, ground into the stone. The door slammed shut. A bolt slid into place with a finality that made her chest collapse. She was alone. Her breathing echoed loudly in the silence, ragged and shallow. She pressed herself to the corner, trying to make herself small, but the room seemed to grow around her, stretching into something vast and hollow. The bulb swayed slightly, throwing shadows that jerked and twisted on the walls. That's when she saw them. The walls were scarred with marks. Scratch marks, dozens of them, some shallow, others deep enough to splinter the stone. Tiny fingernail trails etched into the surface, desperate lines that clawed upward as if reaching for escape. Hannah's throat tightened. She pressed her hand over the scratches, her fingers fitting into the grooves where another child had once been. The thought hollowed her out. They had tried to get out. They hadn't made it. Turning, she noticed the floor scattered with objects, half swallowed by dust. A small shoe, its sole worn thin. A doll missing an arm. Torn notebooks, their pages filled with uneven handwriting. Sentences cut short. words smudged where tears had fallen. She picked one up, brushing away the dust. The page was filled with numbers, then crossed out lines, then a single sentence written over and over. I will be perfect. I will be perfect. I will be perfect. Her hands shook as she set it down. Her rabbit, her only comfort, was gone, left upstairs when they had pulled her from the bed. For the first time, she felt the full weight of being truly alone. A sound stirred in the corner. Hannah froze, straining her ears. But it wasn't sobbing this time, not even chains. Just the faint groan of the pipes above and the trembling of her own breath. Her knees pulled tight to her chest, arms wrapped around herself. Tears burned her eyes, threatening to fall, but she bit her lip hard until the metallic taste of blood filled her mouth. No, she whispered into the silence. I won't cry. Not here. Her voice sounded small, swallowed by the chamber, but speaking it aloud made something inside her solidify. She pressed her forehead to her knees, rocking slightly, forcing the words out again, firmer this time. I will be brave. I will survive. The bulb flickered, dimmed, then steadied again. Her own whisper seemed to steady her heartbeat. She thought of Caleb, of his shy smile, of the way he had tried to warn her. She thought of the children whose names she didn't know, the ones who had left behind these shoes, these notebooks, these marks. I won't forget you, she whispered, echoing the promise she had made to the sobbing voice beneath the floorboards. I'll survive for you. The scratches on the wall caught the light for an instant, jagged like a silent chorus of voices urging her onward. She wiped her tears with the back of her sleeve, leaving a faint streak of dirt across her cheek. Her small body still shook, but somewhere beneath the fear, a seed of defiance sparked. The chamber wanted her to break. The Whitlocks wanted her to vanish like the others. But Hannah, curled against the stone, whispered her vow into the dark. They won't erase me. Morning light touched the Whitlock estate with deceptive warmth, painting the marble façade in gold. Inside the dining hall, the children sat in their usual stiff formation. But today, one chair was empty, one nameplate missing. Margaret Whitlock entered with her black book tucked neatly under her arm. Her pearls caught the light as she took her seat, her smile soft and serene. Children, she announced, her tone smooth as honey, our dear Hannah has been placed in another home. A better opportunity for her gifts. Her words floated gently, but the weight behind them pressed like iron. The children nodded on cue, lifting their forks in unison. No one dared to speak. No one asked where Hannah had gone. Their silence was trained, perfected, the silence of children who knew too well what happened when questions lingered. Only one girl let her gaze flicker toward the empty chair. Just for a second. But even that was too much. Margaret's eyes caught her, sharp as glass, and the girl quickly looked down at her plate, her knuckles whitening around her fork. The matter was closed. Hannah had vanished. Later that morning, the Whitlocks arrived at church, as they did every Sunday, sliding seamlessly into their roles as benefactors and saints. Margaret walked arm in arm with Henry, her emerald hat perched at the perfect angle. Parishioners greeted them with reverence, bowing heads, offering blessings. How many children are you caring for now? One neighbor asked, eyes wide with admiration. Margaret's smile never faltered. 17. Hannah has just moved on to a family more suited to her temperament. Such generosity, another whispered. You do the Lord's work. Margaret placed a hand delicately over her heart. "It is our duty. Every child deserves their best chance." The congregation nodded, charmed by the story, enchanted by the myth. No one saw the tightening of Henry's jaw, the shadow in Margaret's gaze. No one noticed the way her gloved fingers tapped rhythmically against her hymnal, as though ticking off a list in that black book. The pastor offered prayers for the Whitlocks' noble sacrifice, and Margaret bowed her head in mock humility. Her lies slid easily into the language of faith, cloaked in virtue so convincing that no one dared to doubt. The neighbors left church that day assured. Hannah was safe, loved, blessed with opportunity. Only Hannah knew the truth. Beneath the mansion, the cellar was colder than night itself. Hannah curled against the damp wall, her arms wrapped tight around her knees. Her breaths came in shallow bursts, each one visible in the thin light of the swaying bulb. Her body ached from the stone floor, her fingers stiff with cold. She tried to shift, but the scrape of her movement echoed too loudly, making her shrink smaller, as though even sound was dangerous here. Hours stretched like days. Hunger gnawed at her stomach, but worse than the hunger was the waiting. The waiting for footsteps, for voices, for something, anything, that might break the silence. Sometimes she thought she heard them, faint sobs drifting through the cracks, whispers too soft to understand. At other times, she swore she felt eyes on her again, pressing from the darkness, unseen but present. She whispered to herself, her voice trembling, "Stay brave, Hannah. Stay brave. Someone will come." But even as she said it, the words cracked. Because deep inside, a part of her feared the truth. No one was coming. The mansion above had already erased her. Evening came, and the estate glowed with lanterns once more. The Whitlocks hosted another supper, laughter spilling across polished wood. Glasses clinked, forks rang against china. No one mentioned Hannah. No one noticed the rabbit left behind on her bed, its one ear bent toward the door like it was still waiting for her to return. And beneath them, in the damp belly of the house, a little girl shivered in the dark, whispering promises into the silence just to hear the sound of her own voice. "I will survive. I won't let them erase me." But as the hours crawled past and the shadows deepened around her, Hannah felt the weight of vanishing. Her name stolen, her place erased, her existence swallowed whole. The world above believed she was gone. And for the first time in her short life, Hannah wondered if maybe she was. At first, the news of Hannah's transfer was accepted without question. Margaret Whitlock had delivered the explanation at church with such grace that few thought to doubt her. Yet whispers have a way of slipping through cracks. And in a small Oregon town, cracks were everywhere. By Monday morning, murmurs had spread through the pews, into grocery lines, across the schoolyard fences. Hannah had been with the Whitlocks only a week. Why would she be moved again so suddenly? And why hadn't anyone seen the family she supposedly went to? At the elementary school, Miss Green, the teacher who had fought hardest to place Hannah in a stable home, frowned at the empty desk near the back of her classroom. Just last week, Hannah's sweater had hung from the chair, her pencil box carefully lined with erasers she never dared use. Now the desk was bare, as though she had never sat there at all. Mrs. Green asked the office for records of Hannah's transfer. None were filed. She called the foster system, who insisted no official placement had been processed. Her unease grew heavy, like a stone in her chest. That evening, she brought her concerns to the police. "I know the Whitlocks have..." Influence, she said, her hands twisting together on the desk of the precinct. But something isn't right. That little girl was here one day, gone the next. No paperwork, no warning. It doesn't add up. The officer across from her, a man with thinning hair and weary eyes, sighed. Miss Green, with all respect, the Whitlocks have provided homes for dozens of children. They've donated to our schools, our hospital, even this precinct. If they say Hannah was placed elsewhere, I'm sure it's legitimate. But I checked, Miss Green pressed, her voice sharp. There's no record. Don't you find that strange? The officer shifted uncomfortably. Even if it is, my hands are tied. Without cause. He trailed off, unwilling to finish. Cause, evidence, proof, all words that meant nothing against money and power. Ms. Green left the station with her jaw tight, her heart pounding. If the police wouldn't look deeper, who would? That question lingered in the precinct long after she left. Detective Elena Ruiz sat at her desk in the corner, the file on her screen ignored as she replayed the conversation in her head. She had overheard every word. Ruiz was not the kind of woman who ignored instinct. Instinct had saved her life more than once during her years on the force. She had seen the Whitlocks at public events, their polished smiles, their staged affection for children, their endless donations. She had also seen the way their wards never laughed like other children, never played freely. They moved in lines, spoke in rehearsed sentences, their eyes flicking nervously whenever Margaret's hand tightened on that black book. Ruiz trusted patterns. And the pattern here was wrong. She opened a fresh file on her computer and typed one word into the header. Hannah. 2 days later, rumors thickened. A neighbor whispered she had heard a car engine start in the dead of night, though no one left the house. Another swore she had glimpsed a caretaker carrying something heavy toward the back of the estate, though the curtains were drawn before she could see more. Parents in town began to murmur at pickup lines outside the school. Why was it that children went to the Whitlocks, and so few were ever seen again after a year or two? Why did the family never allow playdates? Never permit visits beyond their gates? Fear warred with reverence. The Whitlocks were wealthy, powerful, beloved for their charity. To accuse them felt unthinkable. And yet, the empty desks, the missing names, the whispers of children gone without explanation. They gnawed at the conscience of the town like termites in wood. Still, at the precinct, the mood remained cautious. Officers muttered about the donations that kept their department afloat. One even joked, uneasily, "You don't bite the hand that feeds you." Elena Ruiz didn't laugh. That night, Ruiz sat in her apartment, her walls lined with boxes of unsolved cases. She poured herself a cup of coffee gone lukewarm and opened her notebook. She wrote Hannah's name at the top of the page, then beneath it, age 9, placed with Whitlocks, missing within a week. She tapped her pen against the paper. She thought of Ms. Green's face, lined with worry. She thought of the neighbors' whispers. She thought of the silence that always seemed to hang around the Whitlocks' children, too heavy, too rehearsed. Her instincts screamed at her. Something was wrong, but more than that, something was being hidden. Ruiz leaned back in her chair, staring out the window at the rain-slicked streets. She knew the risks. The Whitlocks' reach extended far, into politics, law enforcement, even the press. To challenge them was to step into a storm she might not survive. And yet, she couldn't ignore Hannah. She couldn't ignore the feeling that a little girl was out there, waiting in the dark, praying someone would come. Ruiz closed her notebook, her decision made. If no one else would look for Hannah, she would. Alone, if necessary. Detective Elena Ruiz had always trusted two things: her instincts and the instincts of a good dog. Both had saved lives more times than she could count. So when whispers of Hannah's disappearance refused to quiet in her mind, Ruiz knew exactly where to turn. Titan. The retired K9 lived at the edge of town with Officer Daniel Holt, his former handler. Once, Titan had been the pride of the department, a German shepherd whose nose could cut through lies and shadows, whose courage had pulled survivors from rubble and tracked missing children through storms and forest. But time had left its mark. A scar ran across his muzzle where glass had torn his skin. His right ear bent slightly from an old injury. Age had slowed his stride, but not his eyes. Those eyes were sharp still, dark pools that saw what others missed. When Ruiz knocked on Holt's door, the sound of claws on hardwood echoed from inside. A moment later, the door swung open and Titan barreled forward, tail stiff, body taut with excitement and restlessness. Holt followed, weary lines etched into his face. "Detective," he said, surprise in his voice. "Haven't seen you since the Simmons case." Ruiz's gaze dropped to Titan, who circled her once, sniffed, then sat back on his haunches, eyes fixed on her with something almost human. She crouched down, scratching gently behind his scarred ear. "You remember me, don't you, old boy?" Titan let out a low chuff, not quite a bark, more like an acknowledgement. Holt folded his arms. "What brings you here?" Ruiz hesitated, then said, "A little girl, Hannah, 9 years old. She's gone missing from the Whitlocks' care." Holt's brows drew together. "The Whitlocks? You know better than to stir that hornet's nest. Half this town's paychecks trace back to their donations." "I know," Ruiz said quietly, "but something's wrong. I can feel it. And Titan—" She looked at the shepherd, his ears pricked forward, his gaze unwavering. "Titan has always had a way of finding what others don't want us to see." Holt sighed, glancing at the dog. Titan's tail thumped once against the floorboards, as if in answer. The following day, Ruiz drove her unmarked car slowly along the winding road that led past the Whitlock estate. Titan rode in the back seat, his body tense, head lifted toward the open crack of the window. The mansion rose on the hill like a fortress, its gates tall and ornate, its gardens immaculate, even in the drizzle of rain. Ruiz kept her eyes on the road, but her attention flicked to the rearview mirror. Titan's ears had gone rigid. His body leaned forward, nose twitching furiously in the air. Then, without warning, he barked. The sound was sharp, urgent, echoing through the car. He lunged toward the window, pawing at the glass, his throat rumbling with a growl that spoke of more than curiosity. It was recognition. Alarm. "Easy, boy," Ruiz murmured, slowing the car. But Titan wasn't calming. His entire body strained toward the estate, every muscle taut, every bark carrying the weight of insistence. Ruiz's grip tightened on the wheel. Dogs didn't lie, especially not Titan. She pulled to the side of the road, watching the rain slide down the windshield. Titan's barking turned into a restless whine, his eyes never leaving the mansion gates. Inside her chest, the seed of suspicion hardened into certainty. Something was there, something Titan could sense, even from a distance. Ruiz whispered almost to herself, "You smell her, don't you? You smell Hannah." At her words, Titan let out a single bark, loud, resolute, before pressing his nose hard against the glass, fogging it with breath. Ruiz exhaled slowly, her decision made. The town could turn its eyes away. The police could bury their doubts. But Titan's instincts were a compass that never failed, and right now, that compass pointed straight at the Whitlocks. The rain had not stopped by the time Detective Elena Ruiz arrived at the elementary school. The building looked tired under the gray sky, its bricks darkened by years of weather, its windows streaked with water. Children's voices echoed faintly from inside, but one desk near the back of a classroom remained conspicuously empty, Hannah's desk. Miss McGreen met Ruiz at the door, her face drawn with worry. She carried something folded in her arms, faded pink cotton, worn soft with use, Hannah's sweater. "This was left behind, Miss Green said quietly. "She never went anywhere without it." Her voice trembled as she added, "Detective, if you find her—" She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Ruiz accepted the sweater carefully, as though it were fragile glass. The fabric was frayed at the cuffs, one elbow patched clumsily. It carried the faintest scent of crayons, chalk dust, and something else. Something uniquely Hannah. Innocence. Childhood. She walked back to her car where Titan waited, sitting tall in the back seat, his eyes fixed on her as if he already knew what she carried. "All right, boy," Ruiz murmured, sliding into the seat beside him. She held out the sweater. "Find her." Titan lowered his head, pressing his scarred muzzle into the fabric. He inhaled deeply once, twice. His body went utterly still. For a moment, the only sound was the storm drumming against the roof. Then Titan's posture changed. His muscles stiffened, ears sharp, tail rigid. A low growl rumbled in his throat, vibrating through the car like distant thunder. He knew. Ruiz clipped the leash onto his collar and opened the door. Titan leapt down onto the wet pavement, nose pressed to the ground. He moved in quick, decisive circles, pulling in the scent, locking onto it like a compass finding true north. "Easy," Ruiz whispered, tightening her grip. But Titan wasn't listening. His body surged forward with a force that nearly yanked her off her feet. The leash burned against her palm as he dragged her across the schoolyard, paws splashing through puddles, nails scraping against the sidewalk. "Titan, wait!" But there was no stopping him. His nose skimmed the ground, then lifted toward the wind. He barked once, sharp and insistent, before pulling again, this time with a singular focus. Ruiz's breath caught when she realized where he was leading her. The hill. The Whitlock estate rose in the distance, its iron gates dark against the storm, its mansion silhouetted against the clouds. Titan's growl deepened, his strides lengthening. He wasn't wandering. He wasn't guessing. He was following a trail as clear to him as footprints in snow. Hannah's trail. By the time they reached the base of the estate's gates, Ruiz's boots were soaked through, her hair plastered to her face. Titan strained against the leash, claws raking the gravel, his bark ricocheting off the iron bars. He wanted in. "Damn," Ruiz muttered under her breath, glancing up at the towering house. She tightened her hold on the leash, staring through the bars at the manicured lawns, the lanterns glowing faintly, even in daylight. It looked peaceful, untouchable. But Titan knew better. He barked again, ferocious now, his teeth bared, his body shaking with urgency. All right," Ruiz murmured, crouching to steady him. She stroked his damp fur, her other hand still clutching the pink sweater. "You've found something, haven't you?" Titan's gaze met hers, eyes burning with certainty. He let out a low whine, nudging the fabric once more, before turning back to the estate, growling deep in his chest. It wasn't just instinct, it was conviction. The first real clue had taken shape. Hannah's scent ended here, swallowed by the Whitlock gates. And if Titan was right, and he always was, then Hannah hadn't left this place at all. The Whitlock estate looked almost holy in the pale morning light. Dew clung to the roses along the iron gates, their petals catching the sun like jewels. The mansion stood dignified, its white columns reaching upward, its shutters open to the world in a show of transparency. But Detective Elena Ruiz knew better. Beauty was often a mask. 2 patrol cars rolled slowly up the drive, tires crunching on gravel. Uniformed officers stepped out, adjusting their caps, their faces uneasy. None wanted to be here. The Whitlocks were untouchable in this town. Benefactors, patrons, saints in the eyes of neighbors who owed them everything. Ruiz straightened her coat, Titan at her side. His ears were sharp, his nose quivering with restless energy. He pulled slightly at the leash, every muscle tense. "Remember," Ruiz told the officers, her voice low, "we're calling this a welfare check. Routine. Nothing more." They nodded, though unease flickered in their eyes. Everyone knew a welfare check at the Whitlocks was like stepping into a stage play. Margaret and Henry had rehearsed their roles too well. The heavy doors opened before they even knocked. Margaret Whitlock appeared, her smile soft, her posture impeccable. She wore a cream-colored dress, her pearls gleaming as though she had been waiting for company. "Officers!" she exclaimed with delight, placing a hand over her chest. "What a surprise. Please come in. I was just about to take cookies out of the oven." The officers exchanged uneasy glances. Margaret's charm disarmed like velvet gloves over steel. They stepped into the grand foyer, where sunlight poured through tall windows, scattering across polished marble. The scent of lemon polish mixed with vanilla, wafting from the kitchen. Everything gleamed. Everything was perfect. Titan growled low in his throat. Margaret's smile never faltered, though her eyes flickered to the shepherd with faint disdain. "And who is this handsome fellow?" "Titan," Ruiz said evenly. "Retired K9. He's here to help us cover all bases." Margaret chuckled lightly, though the sound rang hollow. "How thorough of you. Do forgive him if he finds nothing of interest. Our home is spotless, I assure you." In the drawing room, Margaret arranged them like honored guests. Cookies on silver trays, tea poured into porcelain cups. Her voice was honey, her movements graceful. "About Hannah," Ruiz began carefully, setting her untouched cup on the table. Margaret's smile warmed. "Ah, yes, sweet Hannah. Such a bright child. We placed her with a more advanced academy, a school where her gifts could flourish. It was all very sudden, I admit, but the opportunity was too good to pass." Her tone was soothing, confident, rehearsed. It would have convinced anyone else. But Titan didn't care for rehearsals. He paced the room, nose skimming the air. Then he froze, his body stiff. His ears pricked toward the dining hall beyond the open archway. His lips curled, a growl vibrating from deep in his chest. "Quiet, boy," one of the officers muttered nervously. But Titan wasn't quiet. His gaze fixed on the floorboards, eyes dark and unyielding. He barked once, sharp and startling, the sound ricocheting off the polished walls. Margaret's hand tightened around her teacup. The porcelain clinked against the saucer, but her smile never faltered. What an excitable animal. Perhaps the smell of the cookies has him stirred. Titan barked again, louder, clawing at the floor. The sound of nails scraping wood filled the room. He wasn't looking at the cookies. He was looking through the floor. Ruiz leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as she watched Margaret. "Strange, isn't it?" she said softly. "Dogs don't usually bark at cookies." For a split second, Margaret's mask cracked. A flicker in her gaze. Cold, sharp, venomous. Then it was gone, replaced with her practiced warmth. "Well," she said, rising gracefully to her feet, "perhaps I should fetch him a treat to calm him down." But Titan didn't need calming. He needed to dig. And Ruiz, watching Margaret's perfectly painted smile tremble for the first time, knew this was no ordinary welfare check. It was the beginning of a fracture, the first glimpse beneath the mask. And Hannah's scent still lingered here. The dining hall was a cathedral of wealth. Crystal chandeliers hanging like frozen constellations, long polished tables reflecting the glow of candles, portraits of Whitlock ancestors staring down with austere pride. It was meant to awe, to silence questions, to remind guests that they were standing in the home of untouchable benefactors. But Titan wasn't awed. The German shepherd stood in the center of the marble floor, his body rigid, nose pressed low to the ground, his tail lifted, ears pricked forward. A growl rose in his throat, low at first, then building into a steady rumble that vibrated through the cavernous room. "Easy, boy," one officer murmured, tugging lightly at the leash. Titan didn't move. He lowered his head further, sniffing with urgent precision. Then, with sudden violence, he raked his claws against the polished marble. The sharp sound of nails, screeching over stone, cut through the silence like a scream. Scrape, scrape, scrape. White lines marred the pristine floor, each stroke harder than the last. Titan's growl grew feral, and soon his claws began to bleed, smearing faint streaks of red across the stone. "Stop him!" Margaret's voice cracked through the air, high-pitched with something dangerously close to panic. She surged forward, her pearl necklace rattling against her collarbone. "You'll ruin the floor. He's not well trained." But Titan wasn't stopping. His body lunged forward with such force that the leash strained in Ruiz's hand. His paws slammed the marble again and again, as though he were digging through it, trying to tear his way to whatever lay beneath. His teeth bared, saliva flecking the floor. The officers exchanged uneasy glances. They had seen canines alert before, but not like this. Not with such violence, such desperation. Ruiz's eyes narrowed. She crouched low, hand still firm on the leash, her voice calm in contrast to Titan's fury. "What is it, boy?" "What do you smell?" Titan barked once, sharp, deafening, before returning to his frenzied scratching. Blood dotted the marble now, tiny crimson crescents. He didn't care. He was possessed by something primal, a certainty beyond words. Margaret tried to laugh, but the sound rang false, brittle. Perhaps there was a spill beneath the tiles. Old food, rodents, who knows? These houses are ancient. He's simply confused. Her hand fluttered to her pearls, twisting them as though they were a rosary. Her face, once composed in serene control, had grown tight, her smile brittle at the edges. Ruiz didn't look at her. She watched Titan. The way his nostrils flared, the way his claws struck the same place again and again. This wasn't confusion. This was certainty. "He smells something," Ruiz said quietly, her words cutting through the room. The officers shifted uncomfortably. One cleared his throat. "Detective, with all respect, this is the Whitlock's home." "We can't—" Ruiz silenced him with a glance. Her gaze returned to Margaret, whose hands now trembled faintly as she smoothed her dress. "Mrs. Whitlock," Ruiz said evenly, "dogs don't bleed themselves against marble because of a rat." Margaret's lips tightened. Her eyes flicked to the officers, to the scratched floor, then back to Ruiz. She inhaled deeply, forcing her voice steady. "Detective, I assure you, there is nothing here but stone and foundation. If your animal has overreacted, it is hardly evidence of anything sinister. But her words came too quickly, her tone too sharp. Titan's growls drowned out her poise, each sound more damning than proof on paper. Ruiz knelt, her hand resting lightly against Titan's shoulder. The dog panted hard, chest heaving, blood seeping from his worn claws, but his eyes never left the floor. "He's trying to get to something," Ruiz whispered. At that moment, the room's opulence felt thinner than paper. The Whitlock's mask of perfection trembled, and beneath it, Ruiz could feel the truth pressing upward, like the stench of rot trying to escape the soil. Titan's fury in the dining room had not abated. If anything, it grew sharper, more focused. His claws, raw and bleeding from the marble, dug again at the floor before he suddenly jerked sideways, nose to the ground, body lunging toward the far end of the hall. Ruiz barely kept her grip on the leash as the German shepherd surged forward. "Whoa! Titan!" she barked, boots slipping on the polished surface. But Titan was relentless, dragging her with the strength of a creature driven by certainty, not command. The officers followed, nervous glances exchanged as the dog tore down the corridor. Portraits of Whitlock ancestors blurred past in gilded frames, their painted eyes seeming to watch the procession with frozen disapproval. "Detective," one officer muttered, "this isn't procedure." "Procedure can wait," Ruiz snapped, straining to keep up with Titan. "Trust the dog." They reached a narrow passage at the far end of the estate, away from the grand foyers and glittering rooms. The corridor was colder here, less polished, the air heavy with damp. Titan's growl deepened, vibrating like a warning bell. He stopped abruptly at a heavy wooden door set low into the wall. His body stiffened, ears pinned forward, tail straight like a blade. He barked, once, twice, then threw his weight against the door, claws raking furiously at its surface. The officers froze. The sound echoed too loudly in the narrow passage, a primal alarm no one could ignore. Ruiz's eyes narrowed. What's behind this? Before anyone could answer, a figure stepped into view. A caretaker, tall and broad, his suit dark and pressed. His expression was smooth, but his eyes were sharp. He moved deliberately between the door and the officers, his body a human barricade. "Storage," he said evenly. "Nothing more. Cleaning supplies, perhaps old furniture." "The dog is mistaken." Titan lunged at him, teeth bared, leash straining with violent force. The caretaker flinched back a step before regaining his composure. Ruiz stared him down. "Dogs don't mistake fear for furniture." The caretaker's jaw tightened. "I must insist. The family does not appreciate intrusion into private areas." Titan barked again, savage, every muscle trembling with urgency. His paws clawed at the threshold, smearing blood on the wood. The sound was frantic, desperate, as if he could tear the door from its hinges by will alone. "Detective," one officer began cautiously, shifting from foot to foot. "We don't have a warrant for this." Ruiz's voice cut like steel. "This is a welfare check. If a child is in danger, we don't need a warrant. Open the door." The caretaker's gaze flickered, just for a moment. A crack in the mask. Then he folded his hands behind his back, his voice low and calm. "I'm afraid that won't be possible." Ruiz stepped forward, her eyes locked on his. "Then we'll do it without your permission." She gestured sharply, and one of the officers, hesitant but compelled by the authority in her tone, moved forward. Together, they shoved the caretaker aside. He resisted for a heartbeat before stepping back, expression blank, lips pressed into a thin line. "Don't," he muttered. "You'll regret it." But Ruiz ignored him. She nodded to the officer. "Break it." The officer drew back his baton and slammed it against the lock. The wood splintered with a crack. Titan barked wildly, throwing himself against the door in tandem, claws raking the gap as if urging them on. A second blow. The bolt groaned, a third, and the lock snapped. The door swung open with a moan, the hinges screaming. And from the blackness beyond, a wave of odor rolled out, so thick, so foul, that every officer staggered back. The stench of mildew, rot, and something far worse. It was the smell of lives erased, hidden away from the light. Ruiz covered her nose, her stomach tightening. Titan, however, surged forward, nose pressed into the darkness, growling with the fierce certainty of a predator who had cornered the truth. Behind her, one officer whispered, voice trembling, "Jesus Christ, what the hell is in there?" Ruiz's eyes stayed fixed on the yawning dark. Her hand tightened on Titan's leash, though she knew no chain could hold him now. "Something," she said quietly, "they never wanted us to find." The first beam of light sliced into the cellar like a blade. Flashlights swept through the darkness, cutting across stone walls damp with condensation, illuminating cobwebs that swayed like veils in the stale air. The smell was unbearable, rot and rust, layered with the sour stench of fear that had soaked into the walls over years. Titan surged forward, dragging Ruiz down the narrow steps. His nails clicked against the stone as he pulled with unstoppable urgency, his growl rising in the silence like a drumbeat of defiance. "Easy, boy," Ruiz whispered, but her own voice trembled. She had seen a lot in her career, but never had she felt a house fight her like this, its silence, its secrets pressing against her skin. The officers fanned out, beams cutting through the gloom. For a moment, there was nothing, only the echo of boots against stone, the groan of the old foundation. Then, "Detective, over here!" The shout rang out from the far corner. Ruiz's heart lurched as she sprinted toward the light. Titan had already gone ahead, nose pressed to the ground, tail stiff. He barked, sharp and furious, before clawing at a patch of shadow at the end of the wall. The flashlight beams converged. And there she was. Hannah, curled against the wall, her small frame trembling, her wrists raw where iron shackles bit into her skin. Her face was pale, streaked with dirt, her lips cracked and dry. But her chest rose and fell. She was alive. "Hannah," Ruiz whispered, dropping to her knees. The girl flinched at first, eyes wide, blinded by the sudden light. She raised her chained hands as if to shield herself. Then Titan moved forward, pressing his scarred muzzle against her cheek. His fur brushed her skin, warm and solid. Recognition flickered in her eyes. Her breath hitched, and then she broke. A sob tore from her chest, loud, ragged, years of fear and silence crashing out in one sound. She buried her face into Titan's fur, her small fingers gripping him so tightly it seemed she might never let go. The German shepherd stood solid, unmoving, as if he had been born for this moment. He didn't flinch at her tears or her trembling. He pressed closer, wrapping her in a shield of warmth and loyalty, his body saying the words she couldn't believe from anyone else. "You're safe now." Body cameras recorded everything. The chains, the trembling girl, the scarred dog. They caught her cracked lips, forming the words through sobs. "You came for me," she whispered, so faint it was almost lost in the static of radios. But the microphones caught it, every officer heard, And in that single sentence, the truth of the Whitlocks shattered. One officer rushed forward with bolt cutters. The sharp snap of metal rang out as the shackles fell away. Hannah's wrists bore angry red grooves, her skin broken, but she didn't look at them. She only clung tighter to Titan, her tears soaking his fur. "Easy, sweetheart," Ruiz said softly, her voice breaking despite herself. She crouched closer, resisting the urge to reach out too quickly. "You're safe now. We're going to get you out." But Hannah barely moved, her body pressed entirely into Titan's side. The shepherd's steady heartbeat grounded her in a way words never could. Ruiz blinked hard, fighting the sting in her eyes. She had seen children pulled from nightmares before, but never had she seen a bond form this fast, this fiercely. It was as if Hannah had been waiting for Titan all along, and maybe she had. The officers tried to scan the rest of the cellar, their beams sweeping across ledgers, discarded shoes, notebooks, toys half buried in dust. Each object was a scar, each item a story of another child erased, but all of it faded against the sight of Hannah clinging to Titan like a lifeline. Ruiz keyed her radio. "We've got a live one. 9-year-old female, restrained but conscious. Get medics down here, now." Static crackled back, confirming. Above them, thunder rolled faintly across the valley. The storm was passing, but down here, it felt like the world had just broken open. When the medics finally arrived, they tried to lift Hannah onto a stretcher. She fought them at first, her sobs turning frantic. Don't take me." Titan pressed forward, standing between her and the stretcher. Ruiz raised a hand. "Let him go with her. She needs him." The medics exchanged glances, then nodded. Titan climbed carefully onto the stretcher beside Hannah, settling against her small body. She buried her face in his fur once more, her breathing slowing, as though his presence was the only thing keeping her tethered to the world. The stretcher moved toward the stairs. Flashlights lit the way. Cameras captured every moment. And in the center of it all, a child who had nearly vanished, and a dog who had refused to let her. Even after Hannah was carried up the cellar stairs, the air below remained heavy, suffocating. Flashlight beams swept across the chamber, cutting through the gloom to reveal shadows that had hidden for years. Titan lingered at the threshold, his muzzle low, his body tense, as if unwilling to leave until the truth was fully uncovered. The officers moved slowly, their boots crunching over debris that told stories no words could. A broken doll, with one glass eye missing. A line of small shoes, scuffed and abandoned, some so tiny they couldn't have belonged to children older than 5. Torn notebooks lay in piles, pages curled with moisture, the ink blurred but still legible in places. "I will do better. I will not fail. I will be perfect." "God," one officer whispered, lifting a shoe into the beam of his flashlight. "How many kids were down here?" Another officer knelt by a stack of boxes shoved against the far wall. The cardboard was warped with damp, but the contents had been carefully arranged. Files, ledgers, neatly stacked papers bound with ribbon. He opened one. What he saw made his throat close. Pages filled with names, dates of birth, foster system intake records. Each child is meticulously documented in Margaret's cold handwriting. Next to every name was a word, written in dark, deliberate ink: deficient, unworthy, discarded. The officer's voice cracked as he read aloud. Daniel Carter, age 10, deficient. Alicia Monroe, age 7, discarded. Caleb, his voice faltered. Age 11. Unworthy. Caleb. The boy Hannah had whispered to, the one who had warned her. His name was here, reduced to a single cruel judgment. Ruiz moved closer, her jaw tightening. She took the file in her own hands, her eyes scanning the lists. Each child catalogued like inventory. Each life is reduced to failure. It wasn't neglect. It wasn't incompetence. It was a system, a program designed to refine and erase. Another officer found uniforms hanging on a rack in the back of the chamber. Tiny gray garments, lined in rows like a grotesque display. Each bore a tag, names stitched neatly above the breast pocket. Some were slashed with red paint, a mark of rejection. The sight broke the silence. One officer swore under his breath. Another turned his back, pressing the heel of his hand against his eyes. "These were kids," he whispered, voice raw. "They were just kids." Ruiz swallowed hard, forcing herself to keep looking. Her penlight illuminated a separate ledger, thicker than the rest. She opened it and found pages of notes. Margaret's handwriting again, clinical and detached. The child displays signs of disobedience. Correction failed. Removed from program. Child unable to memorize multiplication tables. Marked unworthy. Child prone to tears. Discarded. Every sentence was a knife. Each line severed a child's chance at being seen as human. Ruiz's fingers clenched around the ledger until the edges bit into her skin. She had seen cruelty before. But this was something colder. A deliberate system of perfection and punishment. A belief that children could be refined like diamonds, and those who cracked were simply cast away. An officer's voice broke the silence again. "Detective, there are dozens of names here. Maybe more." His flashlight shook in his hand. If Hannah hadn't been found, she'd be another mark in this book. The words hung heavy in the chamber. Titan growled softly, pacing in the shadows. He stopped at another corner, sniffing at a pile of notebooks tossed carelessly aside. Ruiz bent down, picking one up. The cover was torn, but inside were shaky letters written in a child's hand. "I will be perfect. I will be perfect. I will be perfect." Over and over, filling the page until the pencil broke, leaving deep grooves where the words had been pressed too hard. Ruiz closed the notebook, her chest tight. "No," she whispered under her breath. "You were already enough." Her voice echoed in the silence, a small act of defiance against the ledger's cruelty. The officers gathered the files, stacking them into evidence bags. Each page felt heavier than paper. Each box they carried up the stairs felt like a coffin. Records of lives stolen, discarded, erased from memory until now. As they worked, Titan stood at the foot of the stairs, watching. His fur was bristled, his dark eyes reflecting the beams of light. He had found Hannah, but his work was not done. He was waiting, guarding, making sure the truth followed her into the light. When Ruiz finally closed the last box, she looked around the cellar one final time. The scratches on the walls, the shoes, the dolls, the words carved into notebooks like prayers that had never been answered. Her throat burned, but her voice was steady when she spoke. "This is more than evidence," she said. "This is every missing child they told us didn't exist. Every name they tried to erase. Not anymore." No one replied. Some couldn't speak. One officer wiped his face with his sleeve, muttering a curse. Another stood frozen, his flashlight beam shaking. They were police, trained for crime scenes, but nothing prepared them for this. Not when the victims were children, not when the cruelty was so methodical. As they climbed the stairs, Titan went first, his body taut, his claws clicking against the stone. Behind him, officers carried boxes of ledgers and files, their faces pale. The stench of the cellar clung to them all, a smell they knew would never wash off. For years, the Whitlocks had fooled a town, a church, even the police. But not Titan, not Hannah, not anymore. And with every page carried into the light, the empire of lies the Whitlocks had built was crumbling. The great doors of the Whitlock estate stood wide open, the rain-washed light of late afternoon spilling into the marble foyer. For decades, this house had been a stage for performance, charity galas, smiling photographs, the facade of benevolence. But now, it had become something else. A crime scene. Uniformed officers filled the space, their radios crackling, their boots echoing against the polished floor. Evidence boxes were carried past gilded mirrors, down sweeping staircases, out through the grand doors, where news vans already waited like vultures. The Whitlocks' empire of illusion was crumbling in real time, every secret dragged into the light. Margaret Whitlock stood in the center of it all, her pearls still gleaming against the neckline of her cream dress. Her posture was flawless, her head held high. Even now, surrounded by officers, she exuded control, or the illusion of it. Henry stood at her side, his jaw clenched, his hands curled into fists. Detective Elena Ruiz stepped forward, flanked by two officers. Titan moved beside her, his fur bristling, his eyes locked on Margaret. The dog didn't bark now. He didn't need to. His growl was low, steady, a sound of judgment. "Margaret Whitlock. Henry Whitlock," Ruiz said clearly, her voice carrying across the hall. "You are under arrest." The words cracked through the air like a whip. Gasps erupted from the household staff who had gathered along the walls. Some covered their mouths in shock. Others stared down at the floor, their silence heavy with complicity. Margaret's smile faltered for the first time. She inhaled sharply as the officer stepped forward, snapping cold steel cuffs around her wrists. The clink of metal against pearl bracelets was a sound that seemed to echo through the entire mansion. "You can't do this," Henry barked, his voice booming, desperate. "We've given more to this town than anyone. We've built schools, hospitals." Ruiz cut him off with a look colder than stone. "You built graves for children who trusted you." Henry's words choked in his throat. Margaret leaned closer as Ruiz turned to lead them out. Her voice, stripped of its honeyed veneer, was sharp, venomous. "You don't understand what greatness requires," she hissed. Her eyes burned, her lips trembling with fury. Weakness had to be cut away. Sacrifices had to be made. These children were broken. We were building something better. Ruiz stopped, her face inches from Margaret's, her own voice quiet but deadly steady. "No. You were breaking them to make yourselves feel whole. There's nothing great in that. Only cruelty." For the first time, Margaret had no reply. Only the steel at her wrists and the gaze of a dog who had seen through her mask from the beginning. As they were led toward the doors, a sound stirred in the shadows. Small, tentative at first, then growing, applause. The children, those who had survived within these walls, peeked out from behind banisters, from the edges of doorways, from corners where they had been trained to stay invisible. Their eyes were wide, their faces pale, but their hands clapped softly, quietly, like the fluttering of wings. It wasn't a mockery. It wasn't a celebration. It was something else. The fragile sound of children who, for the first time, saw their captors powerless. Margaret whipped her head toward them, fury igniting in her gaze. But the sound only grew. A few children whispered to each other. One boy smiled faintly, as though he couldn't help it. Another pressed his palms together, whispering a thank you to no one in particular. Titan stood tall, watching them, his ears swiveling toward the sound. His tail gave one slow, steady wag. Outside, cameras flashed as Margaret and Henry were led down the grand staircase. Their neighbors, their admirers, the very town they had fooled for so long, now watched them in disbelief. Some gasped, some shouted. Others simply stared, faces pale with the shock of betrayal. Margaret's head stayed high, her smile forced back into place like armor. But the cuffs at her wrists betrayed her, and Titan's growl, captured on every body cam, drowned her carefully rehearsed poise. Ruiz followed, her face unreadable. She glanced back once at the mansion, at the children's pale faces, peering from the windows, their eyes catching the light like tiny beacons. For the first time, hope flickered in the Whitlock estate. Not because justice had been fully served, not yet, but because the children had seen something they thought impossible. Their captors were leaving, and they weren't coming back. The footage spread like fire. At first it was a shaky clip from a police body cam, grainy, raw, imperfect. Officers sweeping their flashlights across the cellar, Titan lunging forward. And then, that heart-shattering image. Hannah, her tiny wrists bruised from chains, collapsing against the German shepherd's fur. "You came for me," she whispered, voice cracked with exhaustion, captured forever by the camera strapped to Ruiz's vest. Within hours, it was on every news station, every social feed, replayed again and again. Anchors tried to hold their composure, but some couldn't. On a morning broadcast in Chicago, one commentator covered her mouth with trembling fingers, tears streaming freely as she whispered, "God bless that dog." In New York, another voice cracked mid-sentence, pausing for a long silence before muttering, "How could this happen here?" Across living rooms, hospital waiting areas, and airport terminals, strangers sat transfixed. They weren't just watching a rescue. They were watching a mask being ripped away. Outside the Whitlock estate, the crowd grew by the hour. At first, it was only a handful of journalists. Then came neighbors clutching umbrellas, their expressions tight with betrayal. By the second day, it was hundreds. Parents, teachers, college students, retirees, all standing shoulder to shoulder, their voices rising in unison. "Justice for the children," they shouted, their chants echoing against the iron gates. Signs lifted above the crowd, monsters in disguise. No more Whitlocks. Titan is the hero. Some carried photographs of missing children, their faces smiling in school portraits. Others carried candles, their flames trembling in the cold night air. The estate that once hosted glittering galas was now ringed by grief and fury. The Whitlocks' empire of charities collapsed almost instantly. Phone lines at their foundations went unanswered. Donors scrambled to pull their names from plaques. Hospitals quietly removed the Whitlock name from wings that had once carried it with pride. Board members resigned in shame, releasing statements dripping with shock. "We never knew. We never suspected." But the public wasn't convinced. Reporters unearthed financial ledgers, damning connections between philanthropy and disappearance. On primetime television, investigative journalists laid out charts and timelines, pointing to years of ignored signs. The same people who once toasted Margaret Whitlock at charity luncheons now scrambled to distance themselves. Photographs were scrubbed from websites. Partnerships dissolved overnight. The Whitlocks' legacy didn't just crack, it shattered. In the chaos of collapsing empires, Titan became the nation's symbol. Clips of him standing guard beside Hannah replayed in endless loops. Children across the country begged their parents to let them buy stuffed animals in his likeness. Artists painted murals of the German Shepherd with fierce eyes and steady posture, his shadow stretching tall behind him like the guardian he was. At a candlelight vigil in Los Angeles, someone read aloud Hannah's whispered words, "You came for me," and the crowd responded as if in prayer. Titan's image carried something deeper than just heroism. It was loyalty, incorruptible and unbribed. A dog had seen what the entire town had refused to see. A dog had broken the silence no human dared break. In Washington, commentators debated. Some spoke of systemic blindness, of how privilege shielded monsters. Others focused on Titan, arguing that service animals should be given greater recognition, even legal protections. But the most powerful voices weren't politicians. They were ordinary people. A grandmother in Ohio wept on live TV, clutching the photo of her missing grandson, whispering, "If only there had been a Titan for him." A young man in Boston wrote online, "That dog gave me faith again. If loyalty still exists, maybe hope does too." Millions shared his post. Inside a small police station, Detective Elena Ruiz watched the broadcast play on the break room TV. Her coffee sat untouched. Her eyes burned, not from exhaustion alone, but from the weight of it all. Titan lay at her feet, his head resting on his paws. Every few minutes, someone passing by would pause to crouch down, stroking his fur, whispering thanks, as though he were more saint than animal. Titan accepted it quietly, his gaze steady, his breath even. Ruiz leaned forward, elbows on her knees, and whispered low enough that only he could hear. "You changed everything, didn't you?" Titan's tail thumped once, slow and certain. The world had seen the mask fall. The world had seen a child rescued. And the world would not forget. The safe house was quiet. Too quiet. It wasn't a real home. Not in the way Hannah remembered. The kitchen smelled of burnt coffee instead of her mother's cooking. The walls were bare, and every window had heavy curtains drawn tight against the world. Yet for the first time in months, perhaps years, she was safe. Detective Elena Ruiz sat across from her at the wooden table, elbows resting lightly on its surface, trying not to intrude. A recorder sat untouched between them, its red light off. This wasn't an interrogation. This was something else. A moment where the weight of truth pressed against the silence, begging to be released. Hannah clutched Titan's thick fur with both hands. She hadn't let go of him since the rescue, and Ruiz didn't make her. Titan lay on the floor beside her chair, his breathing slow, his eyes sharp whenever the girl flinched. He seemed to know. He wasn't just her protector. He was her anchor to reality. Ruiz spoke softly, almost like a lullaby. "Whenever you're ready, Hannah. Take your time. You're safe now. Nobody's going to hurt you here." The girl's lips trembled. She was only 12, but her eyes had the hollowed-out look of someone much older, someone who had seen too much. She pressed her face into Titan's neck, inhaling his scent like it was air itself, before lifting her head. Her voice was so faint, Ruiz had to lean forward to hear. At night, we could hear them. The words hung there, fragile and jagged. "Who, Hannah?" Ruiz asked gently. The other children, Hannah whispered. Her fingers twisted tighter into Titan's fur until his skin shifted beneath her hands. They cried. Every night. Sometimes they screamed until their voices broke. And then, she stopped, swallowing hard. And then it would get quiet. Too quiet. And we knew. She couldn't finish. Her shoulders shook, her small frame collapsing inward. Titan pressed his head against her chest, a steady weight, a reminder that she wasn't alone anymore. Ruiz's throat tightened. She'd seen cruelty before, but hearing it from the mouth of a child carved something different inside her. She resisted the urge to reach across the table. Instead, she let the silence breathe, letting Hannah hold onto the rhythm of the dog's heartbeat. When the girl spoke again, her words came out like broken glass. They called us projects. Not kids. Projects. If you didn't do what they wanted, they said you were defective. If you cried too much, or got sick, or even asked to go home, they said you were unworthy, and then one day you'd be gone. Her eyes, wide and glistening, met Ruiz's. Gone, like you never existed. Ruiz inhaled slowly through her nose, steadying herself. And what happened to those children, Hannah? The ones who disappeared? Hannah's lips pressed into a trembling line. Her whisper cracked. They said they were erased. The word chilled the room. Erased. Not dead. Not missing. Erased. As though lives could be scrubbed out like chalk on a blackboard. Ruiz forced her jaw to unclench. She kept her voice low, calm, steady. You are not erased, Hannah. Do you hear me? You are here. You are alive. And because of you, no one will ever forget the others. The girl broke then, sobs shaking out of her in waves she had held back for too long. She buried her face against Titan's fur, her tears soaking into his coat. And Titan didn't move, didn't flinch. His amber eyes lifted to Ruiz as if to say, "Hold her together. I'll hold her now." Ruiz reached out slowly, laying her hand lightly on Hannah's arm. The girl didn't pull away. "You were never disposable," Ruiz murmured, her own voice breaking. "And I promise you this, no one will ever throw you away again." For a long time, the only sound in the room was the girl's sobbing, muffled against the steady warmth of her dog guardian. Outside, the city moved on unaware. Horns, sirens, footsteps. But inside, the truth had finally broken free. When Hannah's sobs softened into hiccups, Ruiz clicked on the recorder. Not for evidence, though it would be, but to preserve this child's voice against the silence that had tried to swallow it. "Would you like to tell me more, Hannah?" she asked softly. "Only if you feel ready." The girl wiped her face with the back of her sleeve. She looked at the red blinking light, then back at Ruiz. For the first time since the cellar, she straightened her back. "They thought they erased us," she whispered. "But I remember. I remember everything." Titan had always been a working dog, trained to track, to guard, to obey. But in the weeks after the Whitlock case shattered the nation, he became something far greater. He became a symbol. It started with a single drawing, mailed to the police precinct in a crayon-streaked envelope. A child who had never met Hannah, never seen Titan in person, had drawn him standing tall with a cape on his back, his eyes glowing gold, protecting a circle of children who all held hands. The shaky handwriting at the bottom read, "For Titan, the bravest dog in the world." By the end of that week, there were hundreds. By the next, thousands. Letters from children across the country poured in, folded sheets of notebook paper, construction paper cards, even finger-painted portraits. Each one said the same thing in different words. Thank you for keeping us safe. Thank you for finding Hannah. Thank you for being the kind of hero we can believe in. Detective Ruiz had to clear a storage room in the precinct just to hold them all. Officers walking past would stop, open an envelope, and quietly wipe at their eyes. In a profession scarred by loss and cynicism, Titan had become a rare reminder of why they fought in the first place. But it wasn't just children at a distance who found hope in Titan. Survivors, the very ones pulled from the cellar, frail and hollow-eyed, began to heal in ways no therapy manual could explain. At first they barely spoke, their silence heavy as stone. But when Titan padded into the safe house with his steady gait and calm eyes, something changed. One boy who hadn't spoken since the raid pressed his tiny palm to Titan's chest, felt the heartbeat there, and whispered a single word. Safe. A girl, too terrified to close her eyes at night, finally slept for the first time, because Titan had curled himself across the threshold of her bedroom, guarding it as if it were the only door that mattered in the world. Another survivor, trembling during her first meal, steadied her hand by resting it on Titan's back while she ate. It wasn't dramatic, the way he healed them. It was quiet. It was patient. He didn't demand their trust. He let them give it to him piece by fragile piece, until they could smile again without forcing it. And then there was Hannah. She and Titan were no longer just partners in survival. They were bound in a way that even words couldn't capture. Wherever Hannah went, Titan's shadow followed. If she sat at the kitchen table, Titan curled at her feet. If she walked the garden path outside the safe house, Titan matched her pace, shoulder brushing hers, as if guiding her through a world she was still learning to trust again. At night, when the terrors came, when Hannah woke gasping, clutching at the air, Titan was already there, pressing his warm body against her, grounding her back to the present. She refused to sleep unless he was nearby, and no one had the heart to deny her. Officers even set up a cot in Hannah's room just for Titan. He would lie there with his head resting against her bed frame, his eyes half closed but always alert, as though daring the darkness to try again. Reporters tried to capture it. Photographs of Hannah with her face buried in Titan's fur, of Titan sitting among children like a living sentinel, but none of it ever fully conveyed what he meant. To those children, he wasn't just a dog. He was proof that good could still exist in a world that had tried to erase them. Soon, marches for reform carried banners painted with Titan's likeness. Handmade signs read, "Protect us like Titan does." In city squares, murals bloomed across brick walls. Titan's strong silhouette painted larger than life, a reminder of loyalty, of survival, of guardianship that didn't abandon the vulnerable. But to Hannah, Titan was not a symbol. He was simply hers. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the safe house filled with the muted hum of evening news reports, Hannah sat cross-legged on the floor, Titan sprawled beside her. She brushed her fingers through his fur, her voice barely a whisper. "They thought they could erase me," she said. "But you wouldn't let them." Titan shifted, pressing his head into her lap. Hannah smiled faintly, her eyes tired but brighter than they had been in months. "You're not just my dog. You're my miracle." From the corner of the room, Ruiz watched, her chest heavy with something that felt both like sorrow and hope. She knew the world saw Titan as a hero, as a legend in the making. But sitting here, watching a broken child begin to heal, she understood the truth. Titan wasn't just a symbol. He was salvation, wrapped in fur and bone. He was proof that sometimes the fiercest warriors came on 4 legs, with nothing more than loyalty in their hearts and love in their eyes. And for Hannah, he was the reason she could finally believe in tomorrow. The safe house did not resemble a courtroom, though testimonies filled its rooms. There were no gavels, no juries, only soft chairs with blankets draped across them, trays of cocoa, and officers crouched at eye level with notebooks resting loosely in their hands. Cameras were discreet, their red lights dimmed, so the children would not feel interrogated. One by one, they spoke. Some voices barely rose above whispers. Others broke into jagged fragments as memories forced their way out. A few could not speak at all, clinging instead to stuffed bears or to Titan, the scarred German shepherd lying steady among them. A boy with hollow cheeks spoke first. "There was a room with no windows," he murmured. "We had to sit on the floor. If you messed up, they wrote your name differently." His hands twisted at his sweater. "My sister messed up. She never came back." A girl with brittle hair added, "At night, we heard crying, screaming. They told us it was just dreams. But dreams don't sound like that." The officers exchanged tight looks. Each testimony deepened the weight pressing down on the room. When Hannah's turn came, she sat beside Titan. "We were told we weren't special enough," she whispered. "They called it the refinement. Children were taken. They said they'd come back better. They never did." She stopped, swallowing hard, her hand gripping Titan's fur. "I thought I'd be next." The detectives gave her silence, letting her steady herself. Across the room, children drew instead of speaking. A bolted door, figures in white coats with blurred faces, suns without rays. These stories, spoken or drawn, became fragments of grief stitched together into a picture too vast to deny. The Whitlock estate was not just a crime scene. It was a graveyard of trust and of childhood itself. Outside, journalists waited. They weren't allowed in, but transcripts leaked, word by devastating word. Headlines blazed across screens. A house of lost voices. Children describe refinement program as nightmare. Where are the ones who never returned? On live broadcasts, commentators wept. Parents across the nation pulled their children close. One phrase echoed again and again from the transcripts. "Never came back, never came back, never came back." For every child rescued, another remained missing. Detective Elena Ruiz read through the testimonies late at night. Papers spread like wreckage on her desk. She pinched the bridge of her nose, fighting tears. Around her, seasoned officers sat stunned, cursing under their breath, or staring blankly. "This isn't evidence," Ruiz whispered. "This is grief, written down in children's handwriting." Grief, multiplied by dozens, became undeniable. Vigils sprang up in city squares, candles flickering against the dark as names were spoken aloud. Some had no faces yet, but the remembering itself became defiance. Citizens demanded answers, not just for Hannah, not just for those pulled from the cellar, but for the ones who never came back. Within the safe house walls, the children were protected, but sleep gave no sanctuary. Hannah woke often with screams caught in her throat, pillow damp with tears. The cellar's darkness replayed in her mind. Chains, rust, the faint smell of damp wood. Trembling, she clutched her blanket as if it could shield her. Titan stirred every time. The shepherd pressed against her small body, warm and solid, his steady heartbeat anchoring her. "You're here," she whispered. "Don't leave me." Titan thumped his tail once against the floor, then nuzzled her cheek. His presence spoke more than words. You are not alone. The nightmares returned night after night. Ghostly faces of children who had never come back. Whispers asking, "Why didn't anyone save us?" Hannah would wake shaking, heart pounding. Titan was always there, his gold eyes steady in the dim light, his body an immovable shield. Slowly, she began to fight back. She whispered into his fur, "I'm safe. You're here." Sometimes she described the cellar out loud, making the memories less monstrous by giving them words. Titan listened without judgment. Storms outside rattled the windows, feeding her fear, but Titan's growl was low and firm, a living reminder that not all threats were real. Bit by bit, Hannah began to trust sleep again, not because nightmares vanished, but because she didn't face them alone. Weeks passed. Small victories appeared. Some children laughed again, tentative but real. Others spoke in careful tones. Therapists introduced crayons and blank sheets of paper. Hannah sat at a corner table, Titan beside her. Slowly, she drew. Wings stretching wide, talons softened, guarding a smiling child. Below, she wrote, "My angel dog." Other children followed, sketching Titan as their protector. Stick figures with the shepherd looming above, safe houses bathed in sun, halos glowing over a dog's head. Laughter bubbled when someone gave Titan a mischievous grin in crayon. Detective Ruiz knelt by Hannah's side. "He looks strong," she said softly. "He's not just strong," Hannah whispered. "He's my angel. He never left me." Her hand stroked Titan's fur, the dog nudging her gently as if to agree. Across the room, psychologists took notes. No one underestimated these drawings. They were not distractions but defiance, proof that resilience could be rebuilt with color and paper. Photographs of Hannah's drawing spread to the press, carefully edited to protect identities. The image of Titan with wings became a national symbol of survival. Letters poured in addressed to "Titan, my angel dog." Survivors and strangers alike sent words of encouragement, stories of their own, promises that the children had not been forgotten. The children clutched these letters like talismans. For them, Titan was more than a rescue dog. He was proof that loyalty could outlast cruelty. At night, Hannah made it a ritual. She drew Titan's wings before bed, then curled beside him, whispering, "Don't leave me, ever." His steady warmth reassured her, night after night. Ruiz watched all this with a mixture of relief and fire. She knew PTSD would not disappear overnight. Some children would carry scars forever. But the Whitlocks' crimes had also exposed deeper failures. Schools, agencies, officials who had looked away. "These sessions are evidence too," she told her team. "Evidence that the system failed, but also that healing is possible. The world needs to see both." The safe house itself began to transform. Walls once heavy with silence, filled with murals, sunlit gardens, and Titan's face drawn again and again. Each mark of crayon was rebellion against the past. One boy who had refused to speak drew a corridor with a dog waiting at the far end. "He found me," he whispered. "Like Titan." No more words were needed. Everyone understood. One evening, a small boy tugged Detective Ruiz's sleeve. She knelt to meet his eyes. "Will you remember us?" he asked, voice trembling. Her throat tightened. "Yes," she said firmly. "We will remember every single one of you, and we will make sure no one forgets again." The promise spread through the room, settling like a blanket. For the first time, some of the children smiled, not because their pain was gone, but because it no longer had to be hidden. Hannah added the final touch to her angel dog drawing, a small heart at the base of Titan's wings. She whispered, "I will remember. I will be brave." And in that room, lit by crayons, hesitant laughter, and the steady heartbeat of a scarred German shepherd, healing took root. Not in grand gestures, but in small acts of resilience. A drawing, a whispered promise, a guardian's silent presence. The Whitlocks had built their empire on silence, but silence could not hold forever. The children had spoken, and their voices, fragile, fractured, but unbroken, would change everything. The federal courthouse loomed like a stone sentinel above the city, its marble steps choked with news vans, cameras, and chanting crowds. Protesters held banners that read "No more silence" and "Justice for the lost." Others clutched candles, their flickering flames mirrored in the glass windows of the building. Inside, the air felt heavy, every cough and shuffle swallowed by the vaulted ceilings. Survivors sat in rows, small hands gripping guardians' arms, paper notes folded in nervous fists. At the center of it all, Titan lay at Hannah's feet, his body taut yet calm, ears pricking at each sound. His presence was a living anchor, steadying her trembling form. The Whitlocks entered at last. Margaret's eyes darted like knives, searching for weakness. Henry moved with practiced control, as though each step had been rehearsed. Their lawyers followed with polished briefcases, prepared to recast cruelty as benevolence. The gavel cracked. Silence fell. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Margaret's attorney began, voice smooth as glass, "these accusations are exaggerations." The Whitlocks provided structure, opportunity, something these troubled children desperately needed. His words dripped with calculated charm, designed to sow doubt. But the gallery did not echo with agreement. Survivors shifted, hands tightening on each other. Titan's ears flicked. Hannah held his leash tighter. The first child was called to the stand, a boy no older than 10. His voice wavered as he described cold stone walls, the whisper of children who never came back. He dared a glance at the Whitlocks and found only disdain staring back. His throat constricted, but Titan's watchful gaze lent him courage. "They told us we were failures," he said, voice breaking. "But we survived." The defense tried to object, claiming trauma distorted memory. The judge's gavel fell again. "The testimony stands." Then came Hannah. She rose slowly, Titan following with a soldier's precision. Every eye turned. Every camera lens found her. She held the leash as though it were a lifeline. A Titan brushed her hand with his nose, silent reassurance. "My name is Hannah Whitlock," she began, voice trembling but clear. "I was taken from my school. I was kept in a cellar. They told me I wasn't good enough to live in their world, but Titan found me. He didn't let me die." Her words cracked the courtroom like glass. Margaret stiffened. Henry clenched the arms of his chair. The attorneys whispered frantically, but the tide had shifted. Hannah described the darkness, the smell of damp wood, the nights that felt endless. Yet she also spoke of hope, how Titan's bark had broken the silence, how his presence gave her the right to believe she could live. When she faltered, Titan's steady posture filled the silence, his golden eyes fixed on the Whitlocks, as if to testify himself. Other survivors followed, recounting horrors with halting bravery. Their stories stitched together a pattern no defense could unravel. Titan remained at Hannah's side, silent but undeniable, a living witness. Hours later, the jury filed back in. The room tightened like a drawn bow. Hannah's fingers trembled on Titan's leash. Ruiz leaned forward, knuckles white. Margaret's face was carved in stone, Henry shifting in his seat. The four-person stood, voice steady. On all counts, the defendants, Margaret and Henry Whitlock, are guilty. The words detonated. Survivors exhaled, some sobbing openly. Reporters scribbled furiously. And then Titan barked once, sharp, resonant, final. The sound reverberated, like the punctuation of justice itself. Margaret's jaw dropped in disbelief. Henry's composure crumbled, but it no longer mattered. The truth had landed, immovable. Outside, cheers erupted, flooding the marble steps. Signs waved, voices lifted. Justice for the children. Titan's image already appeared on placards, his bark replayed across social media as the sound of justice. Inside, the judge's words carried a moral weight beyond law. You turned innocence into property, he said, glaring at the Whitlocks. You betrayed the very fabric of society. Let this verdict stand as testament that such betrayal cannot go unpunished. Margaret hissed one final parting line toward Ruiz. Greatness is never understood by the small-minded. But her words fell flat. Shackled, escorted out, she was no longer a matriarch, only a convict. Hannah leaned into Titan, whispering, We did it, boy. We told them. Titan pressed his head against her lap, a silent vow fulfilled. The trial's echoes spread far beyond the chamber. Across the country, vigils honored the children who had never come back. Headlines declared, Justice for the Lost Voices. K9 hero guides truth to light. Clips of Hannah on the stand went viral, Titan at her side, unflinching. Commentators called her courage a moral reckoning. Survivors in other states came forward with their own stories, emboldened by what they had seen. Detective Ruiz, shoulders sagging with exhaustion, knelt beside Hannah. It's over, he whispered. They can't hurt you anymore. She nodded, then buried her face in Titan's fur, inhaling the scent of safety. Titan leaned into her, acknowledging the end of one battle and the beginning of another. Months later, sunlight spilled over the steps of the State House. Banners fluttered. No more silence. Heroes wear fur. Inside, lawmakers debated the Child Safety Oversight Act, mandating unannounced inspections, stricter reporting, and nationwide databases to prevent abuse. In the gallery, Hannah sat with Titan curled at her feet. She traced his leash absent-mindedly, drawing strength from his presence. To her, this was more than politics. It was the promise of safety for children who might never know her name. Ruiz stood nearby, watching as Hannah was offered the microphone. Her voice, small but resolute, carried through the chamber. Titan saved me, she said simply. He stayed. He never left. Now, we have to make sure no one else has to be alone like I was. The room fell into reverent silence. No senator could follow such words with anything less than action. Plans were announced for the Titan Foundation, a national training center to pair K9s with social workers and child advocates. The foundation's motto was etched in stone before it even opened: Guardians of the Innocent. Across the nation, foster agencies adopted new oversight systems. Schools updated safety protocols. Police and social workers trained with K9 partners. And everywhere, Titan's story traveled. His photograph beside Hannah, his bark immortalized as a symbol of justice. At the foundation's opening, Hannah's drawing of Titan with wings and a halo was framed in the entry hall. Beneath it were her words, scrawled in uneven handwriting. "My angel dog." Children touched the glass, whispering their own thanks. On the steps, Hannah leaned against Titan. "We're really changing things," she whispered. Titan pressed his nose to her hand, a quiet acknowledgement. The Whitlock's empire had been built on silence, but silence had broken. Hannah and Titan, girl and dog, survivor and guardian, had transformed grief into action, trauma into reform. For the first time, Hannah allowed herself to believe not only in survival, but in a future remade by truth. And beside her, Titan stood as proof that loyalty, once given, could change the course of lives forever. The house smelled faintly of lavender and freshly baked bread, a fragrance that wrapped around Hannah the first time she stepped through the doorway. It was a modest two-story home with yellow shutters and a wooden porch swing that creaked gently in the breeze. For most children, it might have seemed ordinary. For Hannah, who had known only cellars and cold, locked rooms, it was like walking into sunlight after years of shadow. Margaret Lane bent to meet her at eye level. She was in her early 50s, her face lined not by bitterness, but by decades of smiling. A retired librarian, Margaret had chosen to spend her later years caring for children who needed stability most. Her voice carried a warmth that didn't press, only invited. "Welcome home, sweetheart," she said softly, extending her hand. Hannah hesitated, then slipped her small fingers into Margaret's. The touch was warm, guiding instead of pulling. For the first time in months, she didn't feel dragged. She felt led. Titan padded behind her, nails clicking against the hardwood. Though still officially in the department's care, special permission had been granted for him to visit regularly. Everyone understood. Hannah's healing and Titan's presence were bound together. Wherever she went, he would never be far. That evening, Margaret showed her a room painted sky blue, shelves lined with books, a sunflower quilt folded neatly across the bed. A worn stuffed bear waited by the window. Hannah froze at the sight, overwhelmed. "It's mine?" she whispered. "All yours," Margaret answered. "Every corner, every dream." Titan leapt onto the rug, curling into a protective circle. Hannah ran her hand across the quilt, then pressed her cheek against it, tears slipping silently down her face. Nights settled into new rituals. After dinner, roast chicken, mashed potatoes, warm carrots, Margaret read bedtime stories. She chose old books with faded pages, her voice steady and rhythmic. One evening, while reading Charlotte's Web, Hannah giggled when the pig mispronounced a word. The laugh startled her. She hadn't heard her own laughter in so long. Margaret's throat tightened, eyes moist. That single sound was a miracle. Titan stirred at the sound, lifted his head and glanced at her. When Hannah smiled tentatively, but real, he lowered his head again, satisfied. Days followed with a gentle routine. Mornings brought pancakes and orange juice at the kitchen table, sunlight streaming through lace curtains. Afternoons were for drawing. Crayons scattered across the table as Hannah sketched Titan with wings, Titan guarding castles, Titan with a halo. She always titled him, "My Angel Dog." Evenings remained sacred. Hannah curled against Titan as Margaret read aloud. Some nights the nightmares clawed back, screams muffled into pillows, her body rigid with remembered fear. But Titan was always there, pressing close, grounding her with his steady warmth until her trembling eased. Margaret often found them in the morning, child and dog sprawled together, breathing in rhythm, cocooned in safety. Healing, however, was not straight. Sudden noises could send Hannah into silence. A shattered glass made her hands shake. A raised voice from a neighbor sent her running to her room. Titan followed instantly, pressing against the door until she opened it again and buried her face in his fur. Margaret never scolded. She simply waited with open arms until Hannah was ready. One evening, after another story, Hannah whispered, "Can I call you Mom?" The words were fragile, like glass balanced on the edge of a shelf. Margaret set the book aside, cupped her cheek, and said gently, "Only if you want to, sweetheart. You can call me whatever makes you feel safe." Hannah pressed her forehead against her shoulder. "Mom," she repeated, voice trembling but sure. Titan barked once, softly, as if sealing the moment. From that night on, the house was not just a safe place. It was home. Weeks later, Margaret took Hannah to a meadow beyond town. The field stretched wide beneath the afternoon sun, wildflowers bending in the breeze, birds wheeling overhead. There were no walls, no locked doors, just sky and freedom. Hannah walked hand in hand with Margaret, the grass brushing against her legs. Titan bounded ahead, plunging into tall grass, then leaping out again, his movements both playful and watchful. Hannah's laughter rang bright when he rolled on his back, wriggling in delight. "He's happy here," she whispered. "So are you," Margaret replied, squeezing her hand. Hannah bent to pluck a daisy and tucked it behind her ear. She tossed a stick, and Titan bolted after it, returning proudly. She wrapped her arms around his neck, pressing her face into his fur. "You're the reason I'm still here," she whispered. Titan leaned into her embrace, eyes closing. He didn't need words. He knew. Margaret watched them, silent tears slipping down her cheeks. She had read thousands of stories in her life, but none more profound than this moment. A child finding freedom with her guardian at her side. The years moved softly, like pages turned in a book. Seasons rolled, springs of dogwoods, summers of laughter, winters of snow. Hannah grew, her laughter stronger, her steps more assured. Titan aged too, his muzzle graying, his pace slowing, but his loyalty never faltered. By her teens, Hannah spoke at schools and youth centers. She told her story carefully, bravely. She spoke of the cellar, yes, but also of the day hope walked in on four paws. She told of the bark that shattered silence, the warmth that steadied her through nightmares. She always ended the same way. Courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just stays. Titan stayed, and because of that, I'm here. Children listened in rapt silence. Some clutched their stuffed animals tighter. Some whispered later to their teachers, "I thought I was the only one." Oak Ridge bore visible testament to Titan. In the town square, a mural stretched across the library wall. Titan sitting tall, ears sharp, eyes fierce, while Hannah leaned against him, arms around his neck. Painted beneath, guardians of the innocent. Families visited, leaving flowers, ribbons, and children's drawings at its base. It became a place of gratitude, not grief. When Titan passed, the town gathered for a vigil. Candles flickered across the square like stars. Hannah, now a young woman, stood before the mural, her voice breaking but strong. "He was just a dog," she said softly, "but he never once questioned his purpose. He didn't ask if it was worth it, if he was strong enough. He just stayed. And that's all any of us need to do. For each other, for those who can't fight for themselves. Just stay." The crowd was silent. Then, somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. A simple sound, but to those gathered, it was Titan's voice, echoing through time. When the vigil ended, Hannah pressed her palm against the mural where her painted self leaned against him. The brick was cool, but in her heart, she felt the same warmth she had clung to all those years ago. The steady rhythm of a heartbeat that had whispered, "You're not alone." She closed her eyes, whispered once more, "You're the reason I'm still here." And in that quiet, she believed he heard. Sometimes, the most powerful reminders of love, loyalty, and resilience don't come from people at all, but from the steady eyes and quiet devotion of a dog. German shepherds, with their courage and gentle hearts, have a way of showing us that we are never truly alone. Their loyalty teaches us what it means to stand by someone through every storm, and their presence can heal wounds that words cannot reach. If this story touched you, maybe it's a little nudge to spend an extra moment with your own dog tonight. Whether it's a walk, a gentle pat, or just sitting together in the quiet. And if you'd like to explore ways to deepen that bond, I found a resource that really opened my eyes to how much dogs give us and how we can give back. No pressure, of course. Think of it as something a friend would pass along, simply because it made a difference for them. After all, the greatest gift we can give our dogs is the same gift they've given us all along: our time, our love, and our trust.